Yes, thank you so much, Naledi. We continue our coverage of the declaration that has just been made by the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, chairing the BRICS Summit, the 15th BRICS Summit. Next year, it heads off to Russia. As I pointed out, very important event, very important summit that will be taking place next year. Also considering now the number of new countries that have been included, which, of course, are the 6 new countries, Iran being part of that, the UAE, Argentina. But what about Turkey? What happened there? We don't know what the criteria is as yet around what criteria was used to include the new members. But they're joined now by international news editor Sophie Mokoena, as well as Tsepo Mongai, who is SABC News' economics editor. Sophie, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us. Your takeaways?
Well, I think a bit of a surprise in terms of finalization of the expansion of the group. But when you go back to what all the leaders were saying, it was quite clear that there was that strong political will to have this matter finalized. The shepherd couldn't finalize this issue. And then it was then taken to the ministers. The ministers also couldn't finalize the issue. And as it was expected, the summit of heads of state and government then took this decision. But clearly, China, Russia, and South Africa, they were very clear that there must be an expansion. South Africa, because we benefited from the expansion. And now you have this powerful force. Of course, the membership, they will be formally be accepted in January next year, ahead of the BRICS Summit in Russia. The other thing that I have observed is you now have very powerful oil-rich countries. Iran, Saudi Arabia, you have United Arab Emirates. You still have your own Russia, which has got oil. And therefore you have members of the most powerful group of oil-rich countries, OPEC, being part of this group.
Yeah. And
also, particularly Saudi Arabia. At some point in time, they were very close to the United States of America. Is this a shift? What could have caused this shift? And how are they going to handle this shift?
Yeah.
But you'd recall when President Biden went to the Arab League Summit of the oil-rich countries last year, how he was treated. Even the proposal that he put on the table was not accepted. The writing was on the wall that these oil-rich countries are looking for the alternative.
Yeah, Tsepo, before we deal with the issue around the de-dollarization as well as the common currency, to the point that Sophie raises now around having oil-rich countries joining BRICS, how in the financial sector, in the economic sector, do they look at this new bloc?
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see exactly how is it going to translate into the oil and the sale of oil. Remember, there's been a lot of work that has been done in terms of on the continent, and also China has been leading in terms of building momentum around the payment and trading. And we know that oil is largely traded in US dollar, and there's a lot of centralization, especially among the OPEC members. So breaking away from that tradition, let's say, for example, in terms of transactions, will have to include the financial sector. And I heard that perhaps the ministers of finance and the central bank governors will look into that. And it's going to take a while in terms of enhancing the systems, but I think it's a point of something that they can be used to experiment with some of the things that as they break away from the tradition, especially that you've got a very strong oil exporting countries, and they can start building some of the systems around that. We know, like with the Pan-African payment systems, there's a lot of work has been done. The South African Reserve Bank has been doing a lot of work in terms of the digital currency. A lot of work has been done. So it's just about harmonizing all those systems and getting a buy-in from the financial sector, which might not be an easy thing to do because you've got vast interest, you've got a lot of strong connections with the European countries as well as the US in terms of the systems, and we also know another challenge is that this fight for technology, where you have the US and China on the other side, where companies are being forced to choose which technology are you going to use, and if you use one, you can't use the other. So there's a lot of work that is really needs to be done around that, especially the financial sector and the technology that they're embracing, and having to deal with all lot of issues of experimenting with what is already a new and developing
So speaking about the experiments, we'll already see, for instance, with India and the United Arab Emirates, where they have settled payment in the local currency settlement payment framework. So that experiment has already started, and it's just about 2 weeks ago where they started with this. What is it that the central banks will now have to look into? What is it that the finance ministers would need to look into when it comes to local currency settlement? Is it a de-dollarization that says the alternative is local currency, or a de-dollarization that says the alternative is a common currency amongst the BRICS nations?
I think the work, and personally I think the scope could be around the products and derivatives that have been created around a particular commodity. For example, if you look at a price of oil, you don't just see a price of oil. The financial market has developed a range of products that are worth billions of rand. Now, if you come up with a new product away from that, how do you make it attractive? How do you start building, those products that are part of the financial systems and the value-added products that go with that particular product? The legislation around that, so that there is a bit of harmony and regulation. And we have to admit, our regulation with our BRICS partners are not harmonized. There's a lot of vast difference. The way in which the participants in the financial markets are trained sometimes is vast and it's different. So we need to bring our systems much closer, so that there is a better understanding in terms of what has already been established, and there's a link. But also, we must also remember, we have to maintain our relationship with the European countries and the US countries. We cannot move away from that, and that is going to come up with its own challenges. There are certain demands that are going to be made on our financial system, on our financial participants, if we are going to be deviating and starting to embrace the other systems, and the issue of trust and trying to hold us to so that it's not an easy move, and that is likely to happen.
The USA, the biggest economy in the world, how do you see Joe Biden responding to this? How do you see the US administration responding to this? Because at the core of it also, as President or Prime Minister Modi has pointed out, is this decision also speaks to global governance and the transformation of global institutions and financial institutions.
Well, it speaks to that when you have these powerful economies working together with these kinds of resources. In terms of the transformation of the financial system, these countries are part of these important institutions. Now, you will have a voice when you push for the transformation of the financial system, like your IMF and the World Bank. I think the argument is that you are not going to do away with World Bank and IMF and all of that. But But what you have to do is to ensure that how they do their business, how they treat countries, it is just and fair. Now, you have a situation right now where the developed North, particularly your industrialized countries, the G7, and to an extent the G20, when they take loans, in terms of repayment, the interest is reasonable. But they were established to assist countries to survive certain tough times, and is part of how the United Nations was also established after the Second World War, the intention, the recovery of the global economy. Now you have other bloc, the developing South and the poorer nations. When they go to borrow, the interest is heavy, at times even more than their own GDPs. Therefore, they can't pay back the money, and it gets, it accumulates and accumulates. Yep. That is why recently Zambia had to negotiate, and South Africa had to come in and assist them to negotiate with this. So I think they will have a voice to say how this must be done in terms of transformation.
But what does it then mean for accountability? Because what we notice with what has happened with the Russia invasion to Ukraine, Zimbabwe has spoken about this as well, is how the sanctions are then used as a mechanism to hold people accountable and also to force them to the negotiation table. But when you have a BRICS New Development Bank, for instance, and you have a new payment system that you come up with, what would the criteria be used there? Would they say that we are the type of countries that say that we are against sanctions being placed on countries that invade other countries, as an example?
Well, normally, sanctions, the real sanctions, are the sanctions that have been imposed by the United Nations. In terms of global system, that's what has to be respected. The sanctions that are being imposed by country to country, you can still not comply. Unfortunately, if you have big powers, they use their might as a yardstick to compel you, the smaller country, to comply with their
the demands,
implementation in terms of the sanctions. Sometimes what they are fighting for and why those sanctions are imposed has got nothing to do with your own interest. And this will also assist to ensure that, yes, you have sanctions imposed by country A, B, C, or this group or that, but you still have a formidable bloc that can work together to agree that these sanctions are not just, and therefore let's find a way to continue to survive. Yep. So the payment system that we are talking about, you'll be able to deal with issues of payment system. You don't have to rely on the available payment system that's being dictated by those who think that they are shopkeepers of the world.
Tsepo, you want to add on that?
I think the other point we must not forget, there's always an advantage of being the first in the market. And we must not forget that many of the institutions that are very much aligned to the West, I mean to Americans and the Europeans, have been around for quite some time and are quite entrenched in the market. Yes. And they have a kind of monopoly over certain transactions and traditions and even certain sectors. So it's gonna take a long time for the BRICS members to develop such institutions and to have a vast network and institutional memory that these institutions have developed. Of course, you always have to start somewhere when you do these things. And also, and I would like to go back to the point of training and development. The BRICS members must actually ensure that they strengthen issue of training, institutional capacity among the BRICS members, as they do that, then the new institutions will develop and be able to start to dominate a pocket of certain sectors of the economy or even industries and make a dent there. But also, I think Mam Sophie mentioned the other point of you really need to make sure that you develop systems from within. They also start to strengthen their position as they go and represent many other emerging countries in multilateral organizations, that they start to make sure that their voice as a bloc is more strengthened and they influence from within. And I think that is another thing that they will definitely be doing.